All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to all of you, and a big thank you for coming for this interesting webinar today. In our continuous endeavor of learning and building new perspectives for all of us, we have invited today Mr. Karan Datta to speak on the today's webinar topic. And the topic itself looks to be very interesting, the roaring tiger and menacing dragon. Uh, so as an advisor or maybe as a client, I think most of the time we have only been focusing upon, so when it comes to the investments, we keep focusing upon the economic activities, the business activities, international issues, oil prices, all these things basically we keep track and have some knowledge about. But something which is very important, one of the factor is geopolitical factor, and most of the time it is ignored by most of us. And it's going to be pretty interesting to see how Karan is really going to bring the whole new perspective to this geopolitical crisis. And given the love and hate relationship that we have with China, it's pretty much evident. And I think to put everything into perspective, we will invite Mr. Karan Datta to basically have this session today. Just to give brief about Karan, I think Karan has been in the financial services industry for last 26 years and worked with various organizations like Goldman Sachs, Franklin Templeton, Axis Mutual Fund, Birla Mutual Fund. In his last assignment, he was a chief business officer for Axis Mutual Fund. Now Karan is pretty much active and has a lot of roles to basically cater to related to the board of directors. So he's serving as board of directors to many of the financial services companies now. Apart from that, Karan loves to play sports, drinking coffee, and speaks on current affairs and national security. His father was a fighter pilot, and he has lived in Kashmir for 6 years. And I think that's where that perspective is coming from. So he has seen the impact of terrorism very, very closely, and he has built his own study of all these factors impacting our economic, the impact of all these things on the Indian economy and the GDP. So without taking too much of time, I think I'll hand over to Karan, and let's start this webinar. So over to you, Karan. Thank you so much. And sorry, one more thing, last thing. Towards the end, we will be having the Q&A session. So request all of you to submit their questions in the Q&A segment. So the chat box has been disabled. You will not be able to put anything into chat. So please use Q&A segment to write your questions, and then Vineet will be taking over all these questions one by one. Thank you so much, and I think we are good to start. Over to you, Karan.
Uh, Thanks a lot, Manoj, and thanks, Vineet. First, I'm very happy with all the introductions you made. One of the things you also used, the word you use for me now, is that I'm much more active, and I really appreciate that. Given that I'm no longer in the corporate world, and then to be more active is something I'm very happy about. When the two young men, Vineet and Manoj, first approached me to talk to your clients, I jumped at the opportunity because it's always great to be in support of young advisors who are setting out business. And when I say young, I don't mean young by age. I think not just about that, it's also young in thought and young in enthusiasm. And I really like what you all are building at Wealth Creators. So best of luck with that. One of the other things, Manoj, you alluded to was this is a lot of talk that I'm going to do is about national security, et cetera, and China and India and all of that, which is true. I'm going to spend a lot of time doing that. But a thing that I really want to make clear for everyone on this call today is that virtually every slide that you see will eventually build up to an economic agenda, because finally everything that I end up talking about has an economic impact, has a financial impact, and it is all about money. But it will take time for me to build that story up. So it's not going to happen on the first slide. As we go by, I'll keep sharing with you as to how this finally builds up to an economic angle. And remember that there are two halves to what I'm going to talk about. The first half is about India and her neighbors over the last 60 to 70 years. And that's the first part. The second part is I want to talk about the Indo-China conflict today. And all of this is with the support of a lot of maps, lots of geography, history lessons, etc., etc. But finally, and eventually, I want to make this point very, very important point that finally it is all about money, its economics, and its power of finance. So just give me 30 seconds. I'll quickly get my slides up and we'll start. Um,
Sure, Karan.
so just a quick confirmation. Can you see my slides and can you see my pointer?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to start straight away. Vineet and Manu, do you all want me to wait for any of your clients to join in, or do you think we should start?
No, we are good to start.
Okay, excellent. So like I said, a lot of maps is something that I'll delve into. It's important to set the tone because it's very important to understand the history that we've gone through over the last. I'm particularly talking about post-independence. We've been independent now as a nation for about 73 years. In those 73 years, sometimes when I say this, people get very surprised. But in these 73 years, we've already fought 6 wars. And a lot of those wars I'll talk about as we go through the slides. But we've already fought 6 wars. We started with 47, then we fought a war in 62, the one that we remember a lot. We fought a war against Pakistan in 65. What many don't know is we fought a war against China in 67 and beat them. It was a very short, very narrow war. It was a very quick war, but we really thrashed them. 67. Then we fought a war with Pakistan in 71. Then we fought a war in Kargil in 99. And more importantly, we fight one every day at Siachen. So in this short 73-year history, your country, my country, as citizens of this nation, we've already gone through 6 wars. And so there's something that's not working. There's something amiss out here because it's almost a war every decade. And that's what I want to give the background on as to what could be the reasons for it. Is there an economic agenda behind it? If at all there is an economic agenda, what is it? So the first section, I'll try and cover the background on this entire conflict. The second section, like I said, I'll try and explain and decode why are the Chinese and the Indian armies head to head right now in the current conflict. And from there onwards, we'll see how the mood goes. There is a third section on terrorism and the impact of terrorism on India. We'll see how it goes, and let's see if we cover that as well or not. So here goes my first slide. My first slide is about our country, yours and my country. We are all citizens of this beautiful nation called India. So while a lot has, I mean, this is the political map of India. I'm sure we see it every day. In fact, I have this map back in my room, in my study, and I look at the map quite regularly because it is such a विशाल देश, इतना बड़ा देश है कि इसको actually अगर आप subcontinent भी बुलाओगे, so it is appropriate. In fact, it is called the Indian subcontinent. That is how India is referred to. It's and the size and shape of this country is actually much more complex than sometimes. Probably it is as complex as a continent. And the reason why I say that is because Uttar Pradesh can be completely different from Karnataka. And I'm sure a lot of this you would have heard of. Gujarat is actually bigger than Italy. Uttar Pradesh is bigger than Brazil. And so if you look at it, India is a culmination of many, many different countries put together, and it is complex. And which is why it's also often referred to the Indian subcontinent. And of course, subcontinent also because it has neighboring countries. The other thing that I must share, and this is something everyone knows, but the awareness sometimes escapes us. We're the only country in the world which actually has a ocean named after it. We're the only country in the world with the ocean named after it, the Indian Ocean. No other country has an ocean named after it, which is quite phenomenal, actually, if you think about it. We also have something which no other nation in the world has. We have not very friendly neighbors. One is Pakistan. This is the western flank. On our western borders is Pakistan, and on our eastern borders is China. So apart from having many other beautiful things, we also have these two things which tend to bother us a lot. Like I said, Pakistan is on the western flank, China is on our eastern flank. And at the introduction, I did mention that we've already fought 6 wars between the two nations, between Pakistan, India, and China. India being at the center, we've already fought 6 wars. What is very interesting and something that I must share with all of you is up until 1959, ये जो आप देख रहे हैं China, we actually up until 1959 we never shared a border with China because this was always Tibet. So India always shared its borders with Tibet, never with China. Up until 1959, when the Chinese army marched into Tibet and became an occupational force. So from 1959 till date, our borders have changed because we've got a new countries to align with, which is China. And again, something that you'll be surprised to know that for centuries, there is no written history of a dispute or a conflict or a battle between India and Tibet. So for centuries, that border has been very peaceful till 1959, and things changed after China came into the picture. So there is clearly some conflict which has been brewing for decades, and we'll try and talk about it and I'll try and bring out what the reasons for those could be. Today, I'm speaking to you all from Delhi. I'm based out of Delhi now. I used to be earlier in Bombay. All of you all, and majority of you all are based out of Pune. And so once again, I mean, between Pune and Delhi, and I mean, this entire nation, the beauty of this nation is that you have the sands in Goa. You have these beautiful beaches in Goa. You have the valleys in Kashmir. You have the desert in Rajasthan, and then you have the Seven Sisters in the Northeast. If you look at this as a country, most beautiful, most appropriate, but has two warring neighbors as well. Let me get on to my next slide. This particular map is of a map is a map of a country which I just showed you, the one that happens to be on our western front. This is Pakistan, and I'm not sure of how many of you have visited Pakistan, but in case you haven't, this is a quick look into the political map of Pakistan. We keep talking about Pakistan, but today I just thought, why not spend some time in giving the audience a little bit of an insight into Pakistan, at least political map wise. The reason why I do that very often these days is that so many names come up, and it's very important for us as Indians to know what these names are, where they are, and what their importance could be now and in the future. Let me start with the first name. Please look at my pointer, which is right here in this brownish corner, and look at the size of this area. This is Balochistan. And many people must be hearing about Balochistan these days. It's in the news. It's been in the news over the last 4 to 5 years. It's in the news because Balochistan is a disputed area in Pakistan. At the time of independence, Balochistan was not supposed to be part of Pakistan. It was supposed to be an independent country. For today's discussion, I won't get into that as to why they became part of Pakistan, etc. But I'm just leaving this with all of you that Balochistan was never supposed to be part of Pakistan. It got literally annexed by Pakistan, and so in that sense, Baluchis have never considered themselves as being Pakistani. And look at the size of that state; it's pretty large. The other thing about Balochistan, it's very mineral rich, and there is a lot of source of minerals in Balochistan, which makes it very, very critical for a nation. The second state I want to talk about right now, apart from Balochistan, is Sindh. It's a neighboring state, the light pink one where my pointer is right now. Again, a huge part of Pakistan. If you look at Balochistan and Sindh put together, that's literally 50% of Pakistan. And the thing is, Sindh too is disputed. And funnily enough, I've been making these presentations and slides. My slides are literally 5 years old, and I've been saying for a while that Balochistan and Sindh are disputed areas. Literally 4 days ago, the dispute came out in the open when the entire Sindh provincial police, starting from the Inspector General of Police down to every level, they went on mass resignation, and the military took over because there's a lot of strife going on right now in Pakistan, particularly in Sindh. So with the background that both Balochistan and Sindh are disputed areas, that's 50% of Pakistan seems to be under a bit of strife right now. With that background, I want to shift to another part of Pakistan, which is actually Punjab. Look at the whitish part, creamish whitish. This is what you see out here is the heart of Pakistan. this pretty much is where the establishment on every front comes into the picture, whether it's the military establishment, diplomatic establishment, bureaucratic establishment, business establishment, or for that matter, in any form, people who run Pakistan emerge out of Punjab. It's pretty much Punjab runs Pakistan. So all the Musharraf, the Bajwas, the Nawaz Sharifs, and whatever name you can think of who is important in Pakistan emerges from Punjab. It has a disproportionate share of representation to its culture. And I guess rightly so, because it's the most dominant part of Pakistan. What I want to show you in Pakistan is actually Lahore. So this red dot out here is Lahore. And literally 60 kilometers away is Amritsar. It's like a short 60-kilometer distance. And Manoj mentioned at the start of the call that my dad is a fighter pilot, or at least he was a fighter pilot with the Indian Air Force. If he or any one of the pilots were to take off in their fighter planes, distance of 100 kilometers or 80 kilometers would probably be done in less than 3 minutes. That's how close Amritsar and Lahore are, 80-90 kilometers at max. And so there are many commonalities between the Punjab of India and the Punjab of Pakistan, the food, the language, etc., etc. But that's where it ends. The representation, of course, is much more for the Punjabi establishment in Pakistan. Now, I just want to go back and what I want to do is take you to one area called the Northwest Frontier Province. That's the Wild West in Pakistan. It's like the Texas. यहाँ पे सिर्फ gun का राज चलता है. So a lot of the Haqqani network, the army is at constant battle out here, trying to kind of quell the Haqqani network, etc. But it's like the Wild West. And finally, I want to come to this purple patch out here called the Northern Areas. In the political map, you see it as the Northern Areas. It's called Gilgit-Baltistan. This is one area that again and again you hear a lot about. And I want you to take a snapshot or remember this purple patch, and we will go back to the previous slide, which is this one, because today's discussion, I'm going to spend a lot of time on Jammu and Kashmir. And the reason for the spending a lot of time in Jammu and Kashmir is because it has an intrinsic, it's kind of joined at the hip as far as relationships between India, China, Pakistan are concerned. So today, I want to spend a lot of time on Jammu and Kashmir. Having said that, please look at this purple patch, the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and the area protruding out here, and the area out here. So this is how we know Jammu and Kashmir to be, which is the right way to look at it. But suddenly you'll notice that another country, a neighboring country, is also showing the same purple patch in its own political map. Something is not correct. Someone has got it wrong. And so this has been a 70-year dispute. And the dispute is clearly what we call as Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and the area that is known as Gilgit-Baltistan. So like I said, I'm going to spend a little bit of time today delving into the geography of Jammu and Kashmir, showing all of you all the details around Jammu and Kashmir on the present day scenario, and then talking about what it means going ahead. So this is the ground position as we speak. I'm going to leave this map here for 10-20 seconds. Please absorb it and I'll talk about it. But just for now, just have a quick look at it. So this, I'm just leaving for all of you to have a quick look at the map of Jammu and Kashmir. Have a quick look at it and I'll explain this in detail. Okay, so now very quickly, I want to start with the green patch first. Please look at the green patch, follow the cursor, and you'll notice that it's Pakistan occupied Kashmir illegally. If we went legally, and if we went on documents signed, etc., 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 and the backtrack, etc., Pakistan occupied Kashmir, which is Gilgit-Baltistan, technically, legally belongs to India. And again, I don't want to get into massive amount of history as to what the issue is. But today, we don't control the area in the way that today Pakistan has control over it. And Gilgit-Baltistan, this entire green patch, which is a pretty large part, mind you, it's very large, is currently occupied by Kashmir. So this is one area. I specifically want you now to shift to this red area called Aksai Chin. And this red part is now today for the last few decades controlled by China. It's Aksai Chin. It's this red massive landmass that we lost to the Chinese in 1962. And I will talk about the 1962 war in just a minute. But just want to clear the map out first. So the white part, the remainder white part that you see on the Jammu and Kashmir is what India controls for now, uh, politically, legally, administratively, and that's our area of influence today. It could change dramatically. That's a big possibility, and we'll talk about that later. But the white part is what we control now. So you saw the green, which is POK, Gilgit Baltistan. You saw the red, but there's another red piece that I want to take you to, which is this 1963 territory ceded by Pakistan to China. In 1963, just 1 year after the 62 war, Pakistan took a part of this valley called the Shaksgam Valley right through this. It's not a very large part, but a very critical part called the Shaksgam Valley. The beauty about Shaksgam Valley is it's the land with the highest number of glaciers in the world. Roughly 253 glaciers exist around the Shaksgam Valley. In 63, as a gift, Pakistan took this valley and gave it to the Chinese. When I say took it and gave it, basically some meaning they ceded access to China. So now look at the weirdity of the situation. Something that Pakistan legally does not occupy, and that is not been ratified by the United Nations, takes it, A, it occupies it, and B, in 63 as a gift, gives it off to someone else. And they gave off this part, which was, like I said, full of glaciers and was one of the major sources of water, but which is what the Chinese wanted. So I'll leave it here for now. The white part, like I said, is what Jammu and Kashmir is run by India today. I also now want to do in the next slide, delve deeper into the Jammu and Kashmir map. It's very important to get a detailed analysis of Jammu and Kashmir because there are names that you will probably be hearing now, in the future, in the past, and much more going ahead. Places such as Siachen, places such as Daulat Beg Oldi, places such as Galwan Valley, places such as simple place like Ladakh. Now, I want to just microscopically go deeper into Jammu and Kashmir. And the reason I'm doing this is not to make this a geography lesson, but as aware Indians, we must know where lies these locations so that next time there's a conversation happening around you, you can figure out the importance of that conversation. And so let me just delve a little deeper into microscopically looking at Jammu and Kashmir. So this is a slightly detailed map of Jammu and Kashmir with more detail. I'll explain. Let me start with first things first. Please look at my pointer on this light gray part. It's a triangle. This is a triangle. This is the Siachen Glacier. The importance of Siachen Glacier I'll explain in a bit. But this glacier is the highest point that any army operates out of. The Indian Army occupied the Siachen Glacier in 1984 under Operation Meghdoot. That's roughly 35 years ago. For 35 years, the Indian Army has been based out of Siachen Glacier in temperatures ranging from -35 to -50. And this now, the battle-hardened Indian Army has done this now for 35 years. There is not a single army in the world which has occupied those heights for that long and has successfully done it. And the Indian Army doesn't lose Jawans and officers at Siachen to bullets. It loses its Jawans and its team to the weather. It's very difficult for me to physically explain what -35 means. Of course, of course it's extreme, and of course the clothing is obviously appropriate, and yet the elements will get you. No single soldier is allowed to be at Siachen heights for more than 3 months. By the 4th month, if he survives mentally, then he has to be brought back down to the base, because by the 4th month he will lose all sensibilities. His vision, his hearing, his mental capacity will start degrading because of lack of oxygen and the extreme temperature. And yet for 34 long years, we've been controlling those heights. The reason for controlling those heights is because you can easily say, "Wahan to kuch hone nahi wala hai." it's minus 35 degrees, 20,000 feet per sirf, it's only going to be ice and ice storms. Fact of the matter is that Siachen is strategically important for India because it borders both Pakistan and China. And in that sense, Siachen overlooks the Shaksgam Valley and overlooks parts of Gilgit-Baltistan. And it's at a height. And please remember, in any battle situation, he who owns the heights owns the um, owns the advantage. So Siachen is an advantage that the Indians have gained, with which we have oversight over the Shaksgam Valley, and then we have oversight over parts of Gilgit-Baltistan, LOC. Along with Siachen, what I wanted to now show you is this big yellow dot that you see out here. It's a name again that'll keep coming up in all our conversations, whether newspapers, etc., or references. And if any one of you is interested in national security and all, this name will come up very often. Daulat Beg Oldi is the highest uh, airport airfield ever built in the history of mankind. No other air force has built an airport at these heights. So Siachen is 20,000 feet. 20,000 feet is where soldiers are posted. Underneath that, at Daulat Beg Oldi, is the highest airport that the Indian Air Force has built. And, and today, as we speak, heavy transport aircrafts like the IL-76, C-17 Globemasters are now landing out here at Daulat Beg Oldi and providing a whole lot of logistics support to soldiers at Siachen. Not just the airport, what you see, this dotted line going, this dotted passing through Galwan Valley, this entire dotted line is a brand new, very well made, recently inaugurated highway. It's a strategic road that has been built right through Hot Springs and Galwan Valley. Galwan Valley is a name that will ring a bell in your minds. This highway has just recently been constructed, and it connects Ladakh all the way to Daulat Beg Oldi. And so now you can see suddenly the Indian establishment is busy building infrastructure, roads, airports, airfields, such that it's strategic in nature and it provides tremendous amount of logistical support to the forward bases. Please remember that while India is busy building infrastructure, a lot of this infrastructure was built easily by the Chinese roughly 10, 15, 20 years ago. When we started building this infrastructure, which passes through things like the Galwan Valley, the Chinese have started interrupting and objecting to that infrastructure build-up. And it's very obvious that something like the Galwan Valley event, that massive event, huge event in which we lost 20 soldiers, actually that where that fight took place overlooks the Galwan Valley highway. And we lost 20 soldiers that night in June. But it is the start. It changed the narrative of the conflict because the retaliation that was done by Indian units, whether the Punjab by the Bihar regiment or by the Punjab light infantry, the entire machinery that went into retaliate was absolutely not expected by the Chinese. It seems as if there were losses of between 40 to 65 Chinese soldiers, which they have never acknowledged. But that literally that night changed the entire conflict and brought in a sense of a huge amount of confidence within the Indian forces. And it's no surprise that it happened at Galwan Valley, through which the highway passes, which is a brand new construction. So you can see that the Indian establishment is beginning to irk the Chinese, even though the construction is technically, legally all on our grounds. And I'll cover that a little more as we go in. But I also wanted to show you something else. We've covered a lot about Daulat Beg Oldi, Shaksgam Valley, and Siachen and Aksai Chain, etc. I want to show you where Kargil is. Now, this is where the Kargil war was fought. Many times, if one says that the war in Kargil happened, the belief is Kargil is not here, but Kargil would be somewhere here. Actually, on the international border, no. Kargil is pretty much on the LOC, the line of control. And was another important fight, 1999. And it was fought under very tough conditions because the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force were given strict instructions not to cross the LOC. So they had to be very precise. The Indian Air Force had to be very precise. The Army had to be very precise, etc., etc. But what is very critical about that war is we lost 1,600 soldiers in that war. And in that loss, the officer to soldier loss, meaning how many officers to each, how many officers did we lose to soldiers, is the highest casualty in the history of any battle. Thereby meaning that the officers of the Indian Army actually led the men into battle. So even when 1,600 soldiers died, over 100 officers had died. And so the officer to soldier casualty, it just was very reflective that the Indian Army actually leads its soldiers into battle. And now I just wanted to, leave this map for all of you to know that Kargil is at the LOC. This is Siachen, that's Shaksgam Valley, the one that was gifted to the Chinese. This is Daulat Beg Goldi, Aksai Chain, Galwan Valley, and this is the entire highway that has been very, very recently built by India. Let's get on to the next map. This is an important map. I want you to focus on the red parts. So this is one. This is the western sector. You can see this is one sector. There's another red part called the central sector. It's about 545, and then there is a third red out here called the eastern sector. So we are not in conflict with the Chinese only in one sector. We are in conflict with them in 1, 2, 3 sectors: central, western, and eastern. Western is what I have given that big detail around Aksai Chain and whatever I just showed you. We're also now eyeballing them at central sector, which is Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. There is a short boundary, which is not very large, about roughly 500 odd kilometers at points, which we share with the Chinese. It's better defined, and yet we are now getting into a bit of a strife with the Chinese out there. But the biggest piece where we are in massive dispute is the eastern sector in Arunachal Pradesh from the Chinese point of view. And I'm just sharing that it's a Chinese view. They consider Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. And so when any part of the Indian establishment, political or bureaucratic, does work in Arunachal Pradesh, the Chinese tend to object to that. Clearly, Arunachal Pradesh is an integral part of India, but from a Chinese prism, they consider it as South Tibet. So you can see that we are at dispute or at conflict with the Chinese at 3 different places, not one. So today I just thought, why not also spend some time on the map of China, since so many maps are coming up. So आज थोड़ा China का भी map देख लेते हैं. It's a big nation. Clearly, it's not a small country. You can call it whatever you wish to, but it's important to look at this map because it's just, while it is a big country, I wanted to show you how it came together. So there are 3 parts to it. And so let's just look at proper China. This map actually, till the dotted line is China proper. And you notice that a big portion of China, and understandably so, actually resides along its sea shores, which is East China Sea, South China Sea, and the Yellow Sea. You can see Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and the South China Sea. A lot of the cities, a lot of the population actually is all along the sea, which is quite obvious. That's how the world has built access to the sea, etc. But let's just come to the deeper parts of China. You move away from China proper, and you'll see that China actually is a culmination and annexation of 3 parts. Of course, this is proper China, but then they took away Tibet in 1959, and then they occupied Xinjiang as well. And that's the third name you will hear a lot about, the Xinjiang province, which is currently in the news for a lot of the reasons around the Uyghur Muslims and the treatment that the Chinese do to the Uyghur Muslims. So Xinjiang and Tibet annexed, put together, and then you see that all of China is this culmination of 3 different parts. What is very interesting is that China now seems to have issues with all its neighbors. Look at the neighborhood. South Korea, problem. Japan के साथ problem. Taiwan के साथ perpetual problem. And this is a very serious issue. It is so serious that the start of a conflict in the world could actually be from here. And I do talk about it in later parts of my slides. They're in perpetual conflict with Taiwan. Now they're in conflict with their own state, which is Hong Kong. They've been in, if you just follow my pointer, they are in constant, they've been at loggerheads and battle with Vietnam The last war China ever fought was with Vietnam in 1979. That's the last war that the Chinese fought. And interestingly, the Vietnamese beat the hell out of them. So, and today also they're a little bit of a loggerheads. So you can see the roughly 17 countries that the Chinese have issues with right now, and they're all in the neighborhood: South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Taiwan, etc., etc. So again, not just with India, they seem to be having issues with many parts of the world. And do remember, right at the start, I did very categorically say that while I'm showing you a lot of maps, showing you a lot of history and geography and the background of the conflict, the real thing is that at the end of it, it's all about money. It's all finance and it's all hard economics. And I will start to show that in my subsequent slides. Let me go to the next one. Many times people think that I've got this map ulta, matlab by mistake. No, this is not by mistake. This is by design. Picked this up and I noticed one thing which is now very obvious to everyone, is that while India is a massive country and shares its borders with China and Pakistan, roughly 1,500 kilometers each, that's 3,000 kilometers of border. But the real challenge is the sea and the oceans. Look at the vastness of the ocean. It stretches and stretches and stretches. And obviously, because 60% of Earth is ocean and it's only 40% land. So very obviously, India has the same challenge, that while we have serious issues on land, we have equally serious issues to deal with in the ocean. And the one thing that you must all appreciate is that the country that rules the seas rules the world. That's true for the United States today. They have the most powerful navy in the world, 10 aircraft carriers, 10 of them. Uh, and So that's like the supremacy of the seas right now stands with the United States. But prior to the United States, for roughly 400 years, it was the British rule that kind of governed the world. And that's because of the supremacy of the British on the seas. There was a time when the Spanish and the Portuguese armadas kind of ruled parts of Europe and parts of the Asian continent, Africa, etc. And then there again, you can see he who rules the oceans rules the world. And now in our neighborhood, what we're beginning to see is that China is beginning to establish supremacy, at least in its own area, which is South China Sea, East China Sea, Yellow Sea, and it's kind of building a pretty powerful naval presence in its own area. And I wanted to show this particular slide because it's very important for 2 points: A, trade, and B, naval presence. Let me show you what I mean. This is looks like a very complicated map, photo, whatever, but don't worry, I'll kind of decode it for all of you. First, I just want you to have a look and follow my pointer and go straight to point number 1. And then please follow 1, 2, 3, 4. And the thing is that from 1 till 14, find 14 on the map. I'll help you, don't worry. But 1 to 14 have been the establishment of Chinese naval or air force presence, either on land or on sea or on man-made islands. And all of this construction has been happening over the last 22 years under what the Western researchers called as the string of pearls. The Chinese have never acknowledged this term, the string of pearls, but Western research, Western intelligence has called it the string of pearls, whereby the Chinese are busy building naval presence, military naval presence, or let's say Air Force presence all along its islands, thereby kind of literally stringing together presence to Gherao large parts of Southeast Asia. And so let's just look at the numbers: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and suddenly 7, 8, 9 start coming in our area of influence. 8 is Burma, 9 is Bangladesh, 10 is Sri Lanka, and 12 is a port in Pakistan. I'll talk about it. 13 is Djibouti, and 14 is a star out here in the Middle East. Now, suddenly what you'll notice is that it seems as if China is busy building its naval presence all along this part, where it seems to have strung a very powerful presence and is trying its best to helm India as well. So while these efforts have been going on for 22 odd years, fact of the matter is this was happening, but very recently Sri Lanka has pushed back China, Bangladeshis have pushed back China, Burma has pushed back China, Port Blair has pushed back China, and suddenly in the last 4 to 5 years, all these countries where presence was being put together by the Chinese have all pushed back the development agenda of building naval bases. Let me show you something on the next two slides. You'll understand what I'm trying to say. And we'll probably come back to this slide because there's a couple of things I want to talk about. But let me show you a reverse of what is also happening. So while the string of pearls was being very busily being put together in the last 20 odd years, but something has reversed in the last 5, 6 years, and see what India is up to. And India, over the last 5 years, is busy signing agreements with Seychelles, Maldives, Diego Garcia, Mauritius, Madagascar. So in Madagascar, India has built a listening post. We are now signed a Seychelles MOU with Seychelles to build a airstrip and a docking facility. We have now got Mauritius to build airstrips. So suddenly, India has become very active in this part of the world and is busy building its own, what is known as the necklace of diamonds, to kind of counterpunch the string of pearls. So we've now signed agreements with Chabar. We've got a port coming up in Oman. We've signed agreements in Seychelles. We've signed agreements in Indonesia. In Vietnam, we are providing equipment. Obviously, we are in quad with the Japanese. And it's kind of a bit of a change in the strategic scenario in the last 6 years. And while India is busy doing this, I still want to come back to this entire map, which I said I will come back and show you that yes, this area, the South China Sea, East China Sea, pretty much dominated by the Chinese today. They had started building very serious infrastructure, even in something like Sri Lanka, which is okay. Sri Lanka is like the equivalent of Cuba for the United States. And please remember, in the 60s, the Cuban Missile Crisis was propagated by the fact that the Russians, the Soviet Union, moved nuclear missiles into Cuba right at the doorstep of the United States. And this is exactly what happened with Sri Lanka. The Chinese built or were busy building ports for docking of nuclear submarines. That was Chinese nuclear submarines. And in fact, one nuclear submarine even docked in Sri Lanka. The agreement between India and Sri Lanka is that there will never be docking of nuclear submarines. And if at all there will be a docking, it will be after there is an explicit exchange of agreements between India and Sri Lanka. In this particular case, there was a docking of a nuclear submarine without prior, I don't want to use the word approval, but without prior engagement of talks. And so the situation was very dire about 6, 7 years ago. But slowly and steadily, all these pearls are now being strung apart. Sri Lanka regime in the previous Rajapaksa government was very pro-China. In the new Rajapaksa government, it's starting to change. It's taken away the Hanbantota port from the Chinese. It's actually going to give it to the Americans to build, and partly to the Indian establishment. In Bangladesh, there was building of submarine ports. It's been stopped. India is now busy building agreements with Sheikh Hasina's government. We are now actually providing them infrastructure. In Burma, the diplomats and the Indian Army chief is on a visit. In fact, we've just given a submarine. India has just leased a submarine out to Burma. And literally all this has happened in the last 12, 18 months. So again, I just want to reiterate that while the Chinese were putting the strings together over the last 22 years, but in the last 4 to 6, and particularly in the last 18 months, some of the strings are being pulled apart. Forget pulling apart. India is busy building its own necklace of diamonds to encircle some of, or at least blunt some of the Chinese advantages on the sea. The last thing I want to share is, please look at the Indian Navy's own presence. Very, very powerful along its coast, very powerful. Also in Port Blair and Car Nicobar. In Andaman and Nicobar, we now have a Sukhoi 30 squadron, most sophisticated aircrafts. We have a listening post. Prime Minister Modi has just sanctioned a 30,000 crore package for Andaman and Nicobar, part of which is 5G connectivity. And so I'm suddenly saying that what I'm just saying is we're now investing in the neighborhood, which is something that we had not done in the past. So this is a bit of a background on the string of pearls and the necklace of diamonds. And now I just spend the last, or at least the next 2, 3 slides on the economic aspect of what I'm trying to get at. Why am I showing you all this? Why? What does it mean for India's economic agenda? It's GDP and finally the markets. There is a correlation. Let me now explain the correlation. What I wanted to show you, what I've shown you actually, if you look at the red lines, if you just follow the simple red line, these are seaways. This is the maritime road. आप इसको एक Google map for the sea समझ लीजिए, which is what the Chinese have been busy building. But they've also built an economic belt, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the One Belt, One Road pet project of Xi Jinping. It's been his agenda to build the BRI, the OBOR, One Belt, One Road. 170 odd countries are signatories to this One Belt, One Road, except India. India has not signed the One Belt, One Road, obviously, because the One Belt, One Road passes through, guess what? Gilgit-Baltistan, Shaksgam Valley, which if we were to sign as a partner to OBOR, what we are then saying is that we acknowledge that that highway passes through not India land. And so India has not signed the BRI or the OBOR because it passes through Gilgit-Baltistan, which is legally Indian territory. Let me come to the next slide. If there's any audience out here who's from the merchant navy, they'll understand what I'm going to show next. But this is where the trade parts, the trade angle starts now. The finance angle, the economic angle. What I wanted to take you through very quickly is, please follow my red line and the red marker and assume you are the captain of a merchant navy ship, and this ship is an oil tanker. The job of this oil tanker, as is with any oil tanker, is to leave a port, which let's assume this one is, let's say, Shanghai. It leaves Shanghai and is supposed to collect oil. It'll take this route, collect oil on this route, get into the Arabian Sea, take it from Kuwait in the Middle East and make its way back. That's your job today as the captain of the oil tanker. This is your route. Now I want to show you where all this route passes through. First of all, you take off, you start, you go through South China Sea, you cross all of the South China Sea, massive parts of the sea. You get into what is known as the Malacca Straits. Now, physically, please look at the Malacca Straits. It's a very thin area, a gap. It's literally at the widest point. It's 2 kilometers wide. It's the mother of all traffic jams in the world. 70% of global trade passes through the Malacca Straits, and it creates the biggest congestion ever. So first of all, the tanker has to pass through Malacca Straits, get out of the Malacca Straits, and come straight into the Indian Ocean region, another problem area. And when I say problem area, it's because in the event of a conflict, the capability of the Indian Navy to create a blockade out here is very serious. So for a Chinese oil tanker, it could get blocked out on two very critical pieces. One is the Indian Ocean region, and the second is the Malacca Straits. And the Indian Navy has a presence to go right up till Malacca Straits and create the blockade. And please remember, it's not as if the Chinese Navy does not have the retaliatory capacity. I'm not talking about that. What I'm saying is blocking out trade on the seas through your defensive maneuvers is a massive possibility. Because one of the things of fighting wars is actually blocking economic trade, which is what the Indian Navy can very successfully do in its own region and in the Malacca Straits. And so while this tanker takes this route, it's a very onerous route. And the Chinese have done this for now 20 odd years, but they want an alternative. And this is where things start to get a little tough. And the alternative that they've built over the last few decades, or at least over the last few years, is this. Instead of taking the red line, they want to take the green line. They want to get the oil from Kuwait 100 kilometers away at a port, let's call the port Gwadar, which happens to be in Balochistan. And remember the second slide I showed you, Balochistan mineral rich, disputed, and they let's say they take they kind of undock the petrol or the oil in very simplistic terms at Gwadar port, and let's assume they build infrastructure called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor (CPEC), highways and pipelines to transport the oil over land. So instead of taking this entire red line, they take the green line. Everything that I'm talking to you right now is not fantasy, it's already built. The CPEC is a $50 billion infrastructure that the Chinese have made in Pakistan, and they've actually made Pakistan a debtor nation forever. It's a $50 billion investment. The Gwadar port is up and running. It's now manned by the Chinese. We'll probably soon have Chinese ships docking there. And from there, the idea is to build infrastructure such that you can transport oil through pipelines right through land and straight into Chinese territory, which is ending at Gilgit-Baltistan, or let's say ending at Chaksgam. So the start and the end of the CPC is disputed. Balochistan is disputed, and the end is Gilgit-Baltistan, which is where it ends, which is where the highway ends, because then you get borders of China. Gilgit-Baltistan is disputed, and so is Gwadar. And yet, over the last few decades, the Chinese have built this infrastructure at a cost of $50 billion. I want to show you what happens from the red line to the green line, what it means in economic terms. If you don't take the sea route and take the land route, which ends at Kashgar, the travel time comes down, travel kilometers comes down from 13,000 down to 2,000 kilometers. It's a 1/3 reduction in distance. And in travel time, it's a 1/3 reduction in travel time. 45 days travel time comes down to 10 days. I'm sure there are many businessmen on this call. There are professionals, there are all sorts of investors, and then there are these young men managing your money. What you should think hard about is, if your logistics costs come down by 1/3, you really don't need to produce more, because it will add directly to your bottom line. And this is exactly what the CPEC is doing. The only problem which the Chinese face is that the start and the end all disputed. Gilgit, Baltistan, Gwadar, all three disputed. And this is what now I wanted to share with all of you, is that what we see in disputes between India and China on the issue, or what you see in Kashmir, actually is not religious or political. It is actually all about economics. It is about securing a $50 billion investment, which has an expected return of about $500 billion by way of cost saving. And the reason why I say that is, China has kept India occupied in trying to douse the Kashmir fire, such that we never ask the right questions. Ke Aksai Chin hamara hai, ke Gilgit Baltistan hamara hai, ke Balochistan is a disputed area. And so as a country, we've been so involved taking care of Kashmir because it's been a dousing fire, we've never asked the right questions. And because you never ask the right questions, China has been busy building infrastructure, which is worth $50 billion. In my opinion, and something that I realized some years ago, Pakistan actually is a non-entity. It is an immaterial, irrelevant nation, which actually deserves no attention from the Indian establishment. The real story actually is dealing with China and not with Pakistan. In my opinion, and I say this with great responsibility, Pakistan ceases to be a country. It actually has become the 24th province of China. And we will do ourselves massive disservice as citizens of this nation if we tend to obsess over Pakistan, because it has been like the mill around our necks for the last 50 odd years to keep us so occupied that we just didn't get the time to ask the right question. The minute we started asking the right questions, there is massive pushback. And what are the right questions over the last 6 years? Now, this is on record. I'm not making this up. First things first, the Home Minister Amit Shah on record in the parliament says that Aksai Chin and POK hamara hai, wapis lekar rahenge, in the house, on the floor of the parliament. On Independence Day speech from the Red Fort, Prime Minister Modi makes a point that Baluchi हमारे दोस्त हैं, उनकी सहायता करना हमारा फर्ज है. At one of the Independence Day speeches, he also goes on to say that Gilgit-Baltistan hamara hai. And so suddenly in the last 6 years, the discussion and the mood and the demands have started to change. And when you now start asking very tough questions from the opposition, and in this case, China, there will be massive pushback, because all this while we've never asked these questions. And so when you question the $50 billion investment, you will get massive pushback, because at the end of the day, you will go to any country will go to any extent to protect its $50 billion investment. And remember, it's not about the investment, it's actually about the return on that investment, which is roughly around $500 billion. So in my opinion, Kashmir is actually the only way to have kept India away from discussing these disputed areas. But the good part is it's starting to change now. The discussion is changing. And a lot of that has, partly some of that is abrogation of 370, etc. Many steps that have been taken. So this is the first section I want to talk about, which is to do with the fact that what we've seen over the few decades, the conflict, there is an economic agenda to it. What I want to do very quickly over the next 15 minutes is to take you into a story or zone or understanding as to ye to ho raha tha, but why are India and China in conflict so much so that there is talk of war, or maybe we are already at war today. What has suddenly happened that things have changed and become so nasty overnight? For that, I'll have to take you through a section, and you'll have to hear me out for about 15 minutes. And the current conflict, actually, in my opinion, is not necessarily for land, it's for water. And this I've put together after listening to some really good researchers, people like Maruf Raza, Iqbal Malhotra, who have done tremendous amount of study on this topic. Iqbal Malhotra is a author, researcher who's coming out with a book called Red Fear. You must get that book whenever it comes out. It's sometime in November. He's detailed the Chinese factor in tremendous amount of depth. And so after speaking to them, I put this all together. Parts of it are known and parts of it are kind of, the first part is a little not known to people. It may sound like a James Bond movie to begin with, but at the end of it, you will understand what I'm trying to say. Here again, it's pure economics, it's pure finance, it's pure money. And so here, this time, I don't think the Chinese are here for the land, but they're here for the water. The reason is as follows. And like I said, the first few slides may sound very movie types, but bear with me. There is merit in what I'm trying to show you. Okay, sometime in November 2016, roughly around 4 years ago, a very powerful US warship from the class of USS Zumwalt, which is like the ultimate destroyer that the Americans built, super stealth, extremely well equipped with sophisticated missiles, etc. It rolled out, and with a very heavy cost. I think it cost some $3 billion to build this. Went into sea trials, and when it went into the Panama Canal for sea trials, it just broke down. And when I say this broke down, I'm being very simple about it, or at least trying to make it sound very basic. Fact of the matter is that a destroyer of this class doesn't break down because there is a backup to a backup to a backup. But something went wrong and the destroyer broke down in the Panama Canal. This was in November 2016. And that too, one of the most sophisticated destroyers that the Americans ever built. 3 days before that, within 3 days of each other, the British naval daring class destroyer, HMS Duncan, also suffers propulsion failure, and that too stalls. Something of this magnitude, where you are not brought down by missiles, where there is no fire on the deck, and yet two magnificently sophisticated destroyers from two different countries within 3 days of each other suffer jet propulsion system failure is, well, not almost impossible, it is impossible. till they were attacked upon. And the attack did happen. And there was a tremendous amount of audit that went. The Defense Department of both the countries went into massive amounts of understanding as to what happened. Please remember that these propulsion systems, etc., the degree of obviously procurement of material did take a bit of a let's say it got downgraded, because the Americans and the British wanted to build these warships at lower costs. As a result, what happened is both these ships, and I'll come to the cost angle a little later, but both these ships did come under attack. And the attack was not a missile attack, it was not a bomb attack, it was not a sabotage, so to speak. They came under attack known as electromagnetic pulse, an EMP pulse. EMP is a high burst of energy which cripples all circuitry, all electronic circuitry, which is the source of the energy. So an EMP will destroy and every circuitry around it. And it's a the electromagnetic pulse is such a high source of energy that it's not burn, but it's destruction. And both the destroyers came under an EMP attack. And when the Americans tried to figure out where the attack emerged from, what they realized is that this was an attack carried out by the Chinese. A lot of this is actually not in the public domain. It's come through reading about it, and they've never acknowledged it. The Americans have never acknowledged it. But the resultant action is what I want to tell you. The electromagnetic pulse that attack was an attack on the microchips and semiconductors, which literally burnt up. And what happened is that the Chinese did attack. And as a result of that, what happened is that the Americans figured out that the Chinese have used tiny microchips, semiconductors, to infiltrate US companies. From here onwards, whatever I'm talking to you is in the public domain. Nothing is hidden. The hidden part is that the attack first started on the Defense Department itself. And there's an article which I would strongly urge all of you to read, which is called The Big Hack, how China used tiny microchips to infiltrate America's top companies. Apple, Amazon, etc. were all hacked through tiny microchips. The way it works is that while the circuitry was being built, a lot of it was sourced from the Chinese, and the Chinese were able to put another in the circuitry, a kind of a ghost chip, which could not be tracked, but when embedded embedded inside the entire circuitry, it created havoc with all of these companies. And similarly, it was embedded in the circuitry of the two Defense Department ships, which then, though that singular chip came under attack of an electromagnetic pulse, and it destroyed everything around it. So in a very simple manner, I'm just trying to tell you that the Chinese hacked into corporate America. They also hacked into the defense departments of the British and the Americans. A result of all of this has been that the Americans have banned Huawei and ZTE, something that you are all aware of. That is something known to everyone. It's a backstory that is not known to many, which is what I wanted to share with you. And that backstory came from talking to people like Maruf and Iqbal. And the backstory the backstory is that, but the ban is on Huawei. And Huawei, by the way, is the front for CCP. It's like the front for the Chinese government, one of the largest telecom providers in the world. It got banned. And the ban was such that you can notice out here through articles, two bans happened. One, Huawei was banned from any form of participating in 5G technology. But the bigger ban, and an equally tough ban, was that the three countries, Taiwan, Japan, and America, now have halted supply of microchips to China. And I'm going to explain to you what that means. Two things have happened. Huawei has been banned as a supplier. That means that company cannot take part in any more 5G technology, or for that matter, any form of tenders and contracts. And another form of ban, that no country which is manufacturing microchips will now supply microchips to Huawei. It has turned the fortunes of China. It's turned it around. It's a massive amount of problem for the Chinese. I will explain to you why. Because semiconductors are a weapon. The US wants to starve Huawei of chips. TSMC, which is a Taiwanese chip manufacturing, has halted chip supplies to Huawei. As we speak, today's article, please read ET. In literally all of this, Huawei has suddenly, from world's #1 provider of mobile phones and technology, it's dropped to second. And Huawei has gone on record saying that they don't have the raw material microchips to build phones for the next beyond 1.5 to 2 months more. And what this basically means is, let me come. Why is this important? Why am I sharing this with you? Because China is hungry for chips. It's the biggest importer, manufacturer, and consumer of microchips. In 2017, it consumed $220 billion of microchips and semiconductors. In 2020, it's $300 billion. 60% of all microchip requirements in the world are consumed by the Chinese, 60%. And this is apart from the fact that they also have a pretty decent large capacity to build microchips. And it's quite obvious because Xi Jinping till 2030 wanted to display superiority in technology. And the way to do that was 5G technology and mobile technology. Over the next 10 years, Xi Jinping's agenda was to become the supreme technology king of the world. And so they had this they had this big demand for microchips, for phones, for computers, for high-tech technology, for everything that works. And now you can see that suddenly that has two bans have happened. You can notice out here that so many countries in the red have banned Huawei. This is a slightly old photo. Now what has happened is that $1.5 trillion worth of 5G rollout in 90 countries is being pushed back. This includes countries which were closest to China, something like Denmark, Sweden, and Germany. Very recently, 2 days ago, even Sweden and Denmark have pushed back on Huawei and said no more 5G from Huawei. Germany, which was closest to China, has also pushed back, and obviously many other countries like Americans and the Indians, the Australians, the British, the Japanese have already done that. But $1.5 trillion worth of 5G can be crippling for the Chinese and something which can literally be called as a China's existential crisis, because this can really hurt the Chinese big time. Not just the $1.5 trillion rollout is being pushed back. They've actually not been given access to microchips for the further production of things like mobile phones, etc. I mean, I'm again making it very simple, but microchips and semiconductors are used for virtually everything now. And this two-pronged attack basically means that there could very well be an existential crisis, economic existential crisis for the Chinese. And the thing is that to make microchips, China needs unrestricted access to fresh waters. And when I say microchips, because the technology that you use is very sophisticated, and certainly now for technology for microchips, which is extremely sophisticated, used for, let's say, satellites and missile technology, those microchips need tremendous amount of fresh water, 10,000 liters for the most nanoparticle of a microchip, 10,000 liters of fresh water. And fresh water is not this. It's treated water where the source has to be fresh. It cannot be sea, it cannot be ocean. It has to be a flowing river, fresh water. And please remember, it's not as if the Chinese don't make microchips. They do, they have a massive industry. But the demand is so high, and the Taiwanese have said no, and the Americans have said no, and the Japanese have said no. So they have to start making much more of the microchips. Where is the fresh water? Right in our backyard. If you look at these three dotted areas, this is the Indus River and the Satluj River, and the three tributaries are the Shyok, the Nubra, and they all pass through Aksai chain, Gilgit-Baltistan. Shyok River is the river in which the bodies of the 20 soldiers actually fell when they were killed. And now you will start to put all of this together, that the Chinese need tremendously unrestricted access to Indus and Satluj and all of its tributaries, because they're busy building dams worth $8 billion with the Pakistanis on the Indus River to do two things. One, create dams for massive amount of fresh water. What people don't know is that they're busy building tunnels also and tunneling the water away from Pakistan into the Shaksgam Valley up here, which has sources of desert. And to make microchips, you need fresh water and you need sand. And both are treated to clean microchips and those nanoparticles. And the Chinese are busy building this infrastructure. $8 billion of dams literally signed in the last 10, 12 months. What you probably don't know is that there are 53,000 dams in the world. 26,000 dams are only in China. So it's the most dammed country in the world. And they're busy building more for the simple reason that today they need tremendous amount of fresh water so as to start building the microchip factories. And it's, again, please pardon me if I'm making this sound very simplistic, but that's the background. And to make those microchips, it's very sophisticated technology, but it starts with sources of fresh water. And the Indians are busy building infrastructure right under the noses of the Chinese, which is actually going to stop access to fresh water. And so suddenly India and China are not battling land or helmet top or finger one or finger two or 0.1 or 0.3, which are small, I mean, which seem important, but the real battle is for fresh water. And my last point out here is, in the last 6 years, India has built 65 strategic roads, as you can see out here. Busy building strategic roads and infrastructure. It's something that has happened. I mean, it's not as if all the 65 roads have come up only in the last 65 years. No, that's not. They started in the last 20 years, but the construction completion has actually happened only now. And so it's tribute to, or it's a testament to the fact that the BRO, the Border Roads Organization, has gone absolutely berserk building infrastructure, strategic roads, one of which is the one I showed you beginning May, which goes from Ladakh all the way to Daulat Beg Oldie. And please see where it crosses the Shyok River, the Nubra River, and the Darbo. And so, which is what is really bothering the Chinese, that the Indian establishment, Indian military, Indian army, Indian political establishment is now starting to push back the Chinese. And my last slide on this is that you're seeing a new form of war. It's cyber, it's electromagnetic, it's for water, it's pure economics, and it's trade. And in many ways, microchips is the new oil for which there will be tremendous amount of conflict. And please remember, I started saying that chances are that we won't see a battle beginning in Ladakh. We may see battle in Taiwan. The reason for that is very simple. Taiwan is one of the largest foundries for microchips, and Taiwan has said no to China. And the Chinese way to deal with it is, if you don't give us the microchips, we will follow the policy of the scorched earth policy. Thereby, if we don't get it, we'll not let anyone have it. Chances are that there could be a Taiwanese invasion by the Chinese, and it's very serious. I'm telling you something that is, if you read a little bit deeper, it is a big possibility, which is why the Americans have 3 aircraft carrier battle groups in the South China Sea. Out of the 10, 3 are already in the South China Sea. Let me explain what that means. 3 aircraft battle carrier groups means 250 fighter aircrafts and 70 to 75 battleships. That's how big the armada of the Americans is. Not just that, the Indians have also sent, right after the Galwan Valley incident, the Indian Navy also sent support ships to the Taiwan Straits. So with that little background, not little, with that background on the first phase of the conflict and the second phase of the conflict, I can take a short break now, open it up to Q&A. There is a third aspect as well, which is India's #1 security concern, which is terrorism. I can talk about it now, but there's also the option, Vineet and Manoj, in case you guys want to take Q&A right now, we can do that. And I can then follow it up with the third angle around terrorism, completely dependent on you all.
We don't have any questions as of now, so we can continue with this piece. I think it's going to take not more than 10 to 15 minutes. And after that, we'll open for questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, that works for me, and I'll cover it in 10 minutes.
Sure.
That's the most critical internal issue that India deals is actually terrorism. And I ask this question many times to every person I speak to is, are you a victim of terrorism?
I think we have lost Karan. Just we'll wait for a minute, see if he's able to join back.
India. And they did this study for 20 years. It's very interesting that the study period 94 to 2013, which is what they've written out here, 2013, they took a 20-year period till 2014. I mean, that's this is the time of the research. 20-year research, 1994 to 2013. And they did an economic impact. Please remember, 1994 से start हुआ है and 2013 में end हुआ है. That's 20 years. Prior to 1994, they didn't take into account for different reasons. But let me be very clear here. 80s were full of Punjab terrorism, which is completely overlooked out here. So the point I'm making is what I'm going to share with you is big and impactful, but it still doesn't have a decade of Punjab terrorism that this country faced. And the result was that in 20 years from 1994 to 2013, India faced 6,000 attacks. When I asked this question, how many terror attacks do you think our nation faced in 20 years? The answer is hundreds, 500s. Sometimes, rarely someone says 1,000 attacks. When I say it's 6,000, people generally find it very tough to believe. It is 6,000 attacks, and this is small, medium, large attacks. It's every city in this country has been attacked. I will prove, it's an open challenge to anyone out here. And I don't mean this in a manner that I'm delighted about it. It's the sadness of it. Not a single city, not a single state, not a single location is left which has not been attacked. You can take any name. Every city has been attacked. And so 6,000 attacks, small, medium, large. And I'm just going to share the result. Well, the result was that Moody's figured out that any large attack, and large is, large, you can understand what large means. 2611 equivalent or Kandahar equivalent is a large attack. A large attack takes away 1.5% GDP and 2% investment growth in that year. 1.5% GDP loss, 2% investment growth. How they calculate it is costs of security, the cost that you bear when no tourists come, the cost of airport security, hundreds of things that we face as a cost. And they came to the conclusion 1.5% ka GDP loss, 2% ka investment growth loss. When you put that together and realize that you and me have been under attack every day for the last 20 years, this is a result of one attack, one large attack. My now question to you is, if there is one attack every day, there is logically one large attack every year. If you don't believe me, then let's go back into history. Started with Kanishka, 1993, Kandahar, Mumbai train, 2611. I have hundreds of photos. I can go on and go on. One large attack has always taken place in this country every year, and compound the effect of 1.5% GDP loss and 2% investment coming into this country. If you compound it, in my opinion, and the opinion of economists, we probably lost $500 billion by way of terrorism. It's the biggest impact that has happened on the Indian economy. And it's such a silent impact that you and me don't even realize it. And next time, if someone asks you, or if you need to know, you and me are direct victims of terrorism because it has a complete and absolute impact on our economic livelihoods. And like I said, you can see that what's happening in France today. Now, what does all this mean for the markets? Now, my point is, if we reverse it, if India becomes, by the way, from 2014 till now, in 6 years, there's not been a single terror attack in the country, barring Pulwama. Now, Pulwama was an attack on the security forces, not on you and me, not on civilians, not in a city, not in a hotel. In 6 years, there's not been a single terror attack, and so the number one agenda of this government seems to be making India a safe and secure nation. If that is successful, we may actually add back 1.5% GDP and investment growth over the next 20 years. So the point I'm just trying to make is that who knows that if we are able to control the costs of terrorism, we will add back to GDP growth, and we will add back to FDI, which is foreign direct investment, back into the country simply by becoming a more safe and secure nation. And the example I can give everyone is that if I have a 500 crore ka plant and I want to put a plant, I have two options. एक गुड़गांव में, which is next to me out here in Delhi, safe जगह है, पर कोई टैक्स ब्रेक नहीं है, 5 साल का टैक्स ब्रेक नहीं है. दूसरा ऑप्शन है 500 करोड़ का प्रोजेक्ट आई कैन पुट इन अ नक्सल इन्फेस्टेड एरिया, लेट्स से इन छत्तीसगढ़, जहां पे सेफ्टी थोड़ी सी कम है, थोड़ा सा कम है, बट 5 साल का टैक्स ब्रेक है. वेयर विल यू पुट माई मनी? Clearly, most of the people will say Gurgaon, because everyone wants a safe and secure location. And so my point to you is, it seems as if over the last 6 years, this government is busy making India safer, secure, and destination for FDI, such that people come and put their plants, and hence we are able to attract FDI and create jobs, etc. Because if we don't sort this out, as a nation, we cannot afford 6,000 more terror attacks over the next 20 years. And remember, 6,000 terror attacks, one a day, doesn't come until there is tacit internal support for it. And I'm going to stop it here, open it up for question and answers. Let me know if you have anything you want me to answer.
Fantastic, sir. That was a really eye-opening presentation, a lot of facts and figures. And I'm already getting some feedbacks on WhatsApp. Participants have liked it to the core. Okay. And so we are open for questions. Anyone, if you have any questions, you can put it in the Q&A section and I'll take it off from there.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
So one participant has said that indirectly, yes. So when you ask the question that have you been directly or have you been impacted by the terrorism that has happened in the country? So one of the participants has said that yes, indirectly, because his father was posted in Kashmir in '94 when terrorism was at its peak. But because of that, father had to retire. So that was an economic impact on the family because of terrorism. Mm-hmm. Any other question, anyone?
So there are two questions. I can see Stanley Joseph has a question. Will stoppage in consumers buying Chinese products and deleting Chinese apps actually dent China? It's not. So please remember, banning the app was not so much an economic agenda as much as it was a data privacy issue. And with things like TikTok, which are straight embedded into my phone and your phone, those apps have complete access to your and mine data. And if millions and millions of Indians were using it, so were sensitively posted Indians, which is why banning became more of data and less of an economic impact. And I think that's made a huge difference. Second question, I think Meher has, what is the probability of war? Who will come to the aid of China? How should we plan investment in equities? Which asset class would be a safe haven? Lots of questions, Meher. On the second bit, which is how should we plan investments in equities and which asset class? There are two men out here who are very capable of handling that. Between Manoj and Vineet, I'm sure you're in capable hands. I'll talk about it, but the probability of war is what I'll answer right now. Probability of war is 100% because we are already at war. And please remember, these are the slides I showed you. If you look at, if you just go back to my slides, I did mention that we are already in the format of a new war. We are fighting a cyber war. Australia was hit by cyber war. Their banking infrastructure collapsed for 2 days. Their electricity grids were crippled. They've already suffered cyber war. Electromagnetic was a war on the US Defense Department. Today, we are facing the Chinese for water, which is another form of war. It is pure economics, and there are trade wars. So 20 soldiers have already lost their lives. 50,000 soldiers are eyeball to eyeball. If this is not war, what is? If you think that the only form of war is firing a bullet, we may actually see that too. But in my opinion, we're already in the middle of a war. Okay. And handling it pretty well, actually. Great. Who will come to the aid of China? Well, please remember, this is an interesting question, The Chinese don't have the ability to take losses. Otherwise, they would have declared the number of soldiers who died that night. So they think that by a remote form, they will. Have you noticed one thing? That they've bullied everyone, but they've actually never fought a war since 79. So the Chinese inability to take losses is very big. And the Indian ability to be upfront about the 20 soldiers who lost their lives is another very, very big story. So the Chinese need to come to their own aid, which I think is the Chinese public needs to now disassociate itself from the CCP and figure out what it wants to do with the regime.
And I think there is some bit of revolt already happening, but the media is kind of restricted in China, which is not coming into the public thing. Hong Kong is an example, one example, because Hong Kong, obviously there are foreign media available, so you still get to know a little bit about the Hong Kong crisis. All right, so the next question is Corona crisis a part of China's bio-warfare strategy?
There's no concrete proof yet that it is bio war. There is proof that they suppressed the information after the leakage of the virus. If this comes across as bio warfare, then the implications are tremendously dire for China, because one of the things that the Americans are contemplating doing, and this is just contemplation, no concrete action yet. If this is bio warfare, then the Chinese hold $1.5 trillion of US gilt, US bonds. The Americans could actually say that for that portion of $1.5 trillion, which the Chinese government holds, they will not make any payments. And so technically the Americans will not be a default, but they will invoke the NV Act and say that they will consider the $1.5 trillion as something that is not to be paid. It has massive economic ramifications. It will create ripples in the financial markets, because a country like the US and the dollar will supposedly not repay. But if it is bio warfare, the Americans will contemplate doing that. That could very well mean the end of economic. I mean, if $1.5 trillion gets wiped off from something that you own, is the end of the Chinese economy.
Okay. Next question is, how can India, not being a signatory to a BRI, deter Chinese from not building it? It's a $1 trillion project, so how can the countries resist that temptation?
No, I never said that just because we're not signatories to it, it will not be built. If we were a signatory to it, you cannot stand in the parliament and say, Gilgit Baltistan hamara hai. So the reason we did not sign is because that passes through Indian legal Indian territory, which we don't have yet.
Right.
Okay. And there are 170 countries. Most of those countries, the majority of those countries, which are now beginning to realize the costs of that $1 trillion, are beginning to push back. There are countries which don't want to bear the economic costs of the $1 trillion, because it basically means debtors for life. And in a bank, if you are a bad debt, what happens? तो आपका जो घर होता है या गाड़ी होती है उसको possess कर लिया जाता है. But as a country, if you don't pay back your loan, what will happen? Your ports, your roads, your infrastructure are taken over by the Chinese. So many countries are now beginning to push back, and they are resisting the temptation.
Understood. Okay. Next question is, will China ban improve economy of India? Will they shoot up economic activity in India?
I would think so. It's a long shot. It's not easy, but there are two very big things that I want to answer this question on economics and the GDP of India and the capital markets, and the big belief that everything economics is wrong in India. True. There are many things that we need to do. But please remember, we are a country of 130 crore people. 80 crore people didn't have access to a toilet, to a bank account, to electricity, to a Jan Dhan account, to cooking gas, to a light bulb, to an insurance policy. 80 crore Indians. And in the last 6 years, 80 crore Indians have got access to that. Now, it may not show up in the capital markets or in GDP or in economic growth or in the way you and me understand economic indicators, but suddenly the living conditions for 80 crore Indians has improved. And I'm not even spoken about APMC, the reforms that have happened on agriculture and labor. वो तो मैं बात ही नहीं कर रहा हूँ अभी. So And remember, we are a socialist nation. We are not a capitalist country. So there is an undercurrent, but it seems as if you and me are missing it out. We don't tend to register it, but the condition of 80 crore Indians is beginning to improve, and it is not based on religion. तुम हिंदू हो या मुस्लिम हो या क्रिश्चियन हो, वो 80 करोड़ में आपको लाइट भी मिली है, इलेक्ट्रिसिटी का एक कनेक्शन मिला है, कुकिंग गैस मिली है, एक टॉयलेट मिला है, आपको इंश्योरेंस भी मिली है, क्रॉप इंश्योरेंस भी मिली है. सो कुछ ना कुछ तो हो रहा है इस देश में साइलेंटली दैट यू कैन नॉट ओवरलुक.
Great. Next question is, do you think common people from China support their government stand? How do you look at their perception?
It's a great question. It's something that in the people I speak to, researchers, etc., one of the big stories that is starting to emerge is that there could be a regime change. There could be a regime change in China. We are democratic nations. Today there is the BJP. Tomorrow there is the Congress. Yesterday there was Republicans. Tomorrow there could be Democrats. It's the way the democracies work. But Xi Jinping has established himself as the ruler, lord, and king till he is alive. It's something that the Chinese citizens are starting to realize, because remember, Corona has pushed back brand China big time.
Correct.
They really need to sort this out for their own betterment. It's something that I have a feeling could lead to changes.
Thanks for that. Next question is, what will be your view on the economic impacts as microchips become the new oil? Are we looking at bigger disparity between rich and poor, or more job losses?
No, I'm actually seeing this in another way. It's kind of linked to the question on whether we will become a beneficiary of this big change. I think if you take a 20-year view, if you take the next 20 years, see, the biggest beneficiary of the last 30 years has been China. Who can be the biggest beneficiary over the next 20 years? One of the big nations that can be a big beneficiary is actually India. And part of that program, of course, is about Atmanirbhar Bharat, etc., etc. But more importantly, the world now needs alternative supply chains for itself. And who will benefit? Countries like Vietnam will benefit. They've actually signed 13 trade agreements in the last 10 years. So Vietnam will benefit, India will benefit, Philippines will benefit, Australians will benefit, because there will suddenly be this big demand to find alternate supply chains. And I think India will become a very big beneficiary of that program.
Great. There are a few more questions. So how is China raising so much money for OBOR?
Basically, it is a pretty strong economy. And if you look at the Chinese state, the state owns everything. The state owns the banks, the state owns the insurance companies, the state owns the mutual funds, the state owns the telecom companies. It's the state. And so it's very difficult to differentiate between the state and the corporate. And they're all kind of mixed, which basically means there are two things happening. It's the state which is funding this. It is a state which is also creating the debt bubble when it's lending out to the banks, which in turn is lending out to consumers. So in many ways, the Chinese juggernaut is starting to look like a built on debt. But a lot of this is state funding, which seems to be a mirage over the corporate funding.
Okay. Thank you. Next is, if war happens, what financial crisis do we foresee happening?
The biggest financial crisis in India could be NPAs, non-performing assets, primarily because of COVID. But remember that the biggest problem that Indians have faced, and that you and me have faced, the economic terrorism that we have faced, is actually NPA that got created over the last 20 years. Because at that point in time, the funding was blatantly corrupt. So the point I'm making is, this new form of NPA could be as a result of COVID, because today getting loans for projects that don't exist is very tough. But in the previous 20 odd years, 18, 20, 25 years, the entire NPA was worth 50 lakh crores. That's had a massive impact on the, so you and me have funded it through taxes. We've actually had to keep supplying banks, public sector banks with capital. So that as we were getting out of the NPA cycle through things like the IBC, etc., COVID has hit us. My guess is that one of the big problems for the Indian economy could be the formation of a new set of NPAs. So you all have to be careful about that.
Okay. Next question is, do you think when most of countries stand against China, they will be weak economically?
No, so it's not about a weak economic China. It's about a weak brand China, which is and a weaker bully and a weaker, let's say, country to deal with. Because remember, they've taken on 17, 18 countries simultaneously. And so no one's asking the China. I mean, it's not as if there's an agenda to weaken them economically. Of course, the Americans are doing that because they kind of have figured out that what the Chinese. Remember, this is only 4 years old. The Americans have really literally, it's the Americans who created the Chinese economic superpower, and they are now the ones figuring it out. It's not as if there's a clear-cut agenda to make them economically weak, as much as it is to tone down their single agenda, which is that China is the middle kingdom and everything revolves around them. It's very different from the way Indians think, which is Vasudev Kutum, which basically means the whole world is one and we are all family. Versus the Chinese way of thinking that we are the middle kingdom and everyone revolves around us. I think that's the agenda that's getting sorted.
Okay. There are three more questions, then we'll end. So how much Indian economy will get affected if you reduce trade with China? So does the less amount of import impact India negatively?
Depends on how you look at it, because the way to look at it is, well, so today everything is made in China when it comes to India, virtually everything. If you stop that, you obviously start making it internally, but these are they don't happen overnight. I mean, what I'm trying to say is sounding very, as if things will start manufacturing overnight. But one of the big beneficial things that could come out is for high-tech engineering, for things that we have the capacity and the capability. Indians may start building that infrastructure for themselves. That can have a massive positive impact on the country. But it's not going to happen overnight.
All right. Second last question. How can uprising in HK benefit India and how can we capitalize on that?
I don't think, if you look at it, I don't think it's in the interest of the Indian establishment to take advantage of an uprising in Hong Kong. Nor are the strategic thinkers out here, really kind of orchestrating it, etc., etc. There are no advantages, but there are no disadvantages either.
Okay.
Because it's something it's exactly how the Chinese kept us so hooked on to dealing with Pakistan and Kashmir.
Yeah.
And now they have to contend with that in their own neighborhood.
Okay. All right. The last question. So why Chinese are not still stopping imports from India? Is there an alarm for India because India has stopped many trades with China?
We are a trade deficit country. I mean, we are, in fact, our imports from China are $60 billion. That's fortunately come down by about $10 to $15 billion. I wish our exports to China were high, which they are not. They're not. It will not have an impact on our nation. I wish that could happen where we export a lot to China. Unfortunately, that's not happening. So it really doesn't have an economic impact.
Okay. All right. So that were all the questions from our participants. So thank you very much, Karan sir, for giving such fantastic and rich insights. Everyone has loved this, and we would love to have you for some other topic in near future. And thank you all the participants for taking our time. I'm sure you found this an enriching experience and learning about why we need to also be looking at the geopolitical risk in India. And not only looking at the markets, because something eventually will play out positively, negatively. So we need to understand those things as well. All right. So with this, we end the session. So thank you very much again, everyone. And any last words from you, Manoj or Karan sir? Anything you would like to say?
Manoj, if he's there, he can talk. I'll end it up. Then.
Yeah.
No, I think it has been really a fantastic session, Karan, and we thoroughly enjoyed it, and which can be understood from the kind of questions that we had from our participants. So it was a really great insight, and hope to see you in our next session with some interesting topic.
I would love to do that. What you are building and take care of the clients and build a great book. And thank you all for coming and Jai Hind.
Jai Hind. Thank you.